Yes, I do. I think that the world now has a number of critical issues accumulating. Of course, there is first the macro impact of a number of things, still the COVID outburst in China with the lockdown, the consequence of the war. This has led to a much more complicated macro environment in terms of stagflation, so that's one. Then we have the energy crisis and potentially a food crisis coming in. Then we have the confidence crisis, given the change in the security outlook for the world with the war. And then we have also a further fragmentation of the global trade and investment system as a result of the sanctions that have been applied. And then we also have some noises around global governance and some divisions that have emerged in the recent meetings of the G20 and other international fora. So I think we're dealing with quite a number of challenging issues all at the same time.
Yeah, I counted 7 there, and I don't know where to start. So I'm going to start with the toolkit that potentially we have available to fight these multiple challenges as well. How do you think the toolkit looks from governments and central banks? The worry from me standing on the outside is that actually we've used a lot of the firepower in previous crises, and actually government balance sheets and central bank toolkits are exhausted in many cases.
I think that this is more the case for the public finances than for central banks. If central banks now have to fight inflation, I think that means interest rates going up. And I think that there are no restrictions there in principle, but they have to be very careful on how to manage the interest rate increases in order to make sure inflation comes back under control without exercising excessive pain on the economy. And of course, the traditional recipe in these circumstances is that you combine the monetary tightening with some softening of the blow for the economy in terms of fiscal policy. But the question is, what's the room for maneuver regarding fiscal policy? And that is something which is more abundant in advanced economies than in emerging markets, and particularly in developing economies. And I think that is in the later, where circumstances are going to be more complicated.
Yeah, again, you've raised more questions for me as well. So let me just start off on the rate hikes as well. There's some absolutely fantastic guests I have on Scorebox who disagree with me wholeheartedly about the benefits of rate hikes in this environment. They say it will only compound the misery for individuals, for corporations and for governments as well. How do you counter that by saying that the rate hikes are necessary to counter the inflation threat we're seeing?
I think that if we let inflation go on and become sort of embedded into the system, it's likely to become even higher rather than lower. And I think we're going to feel even bigger costs. So I think you have to pay some short-term price in order to bring inflation down. Otherwise, you'll have to pay a longer-term cost. And we know how costly high inflation is. And many people who are very young have forgotten how inflation was in the 70s and what it took to bring inflation down, and why that was very important for the world and led to a period of prosperity with low inflation, stability. I think that we should not go and repeat the mistakes we made in the 70s. We have to fight inflation, pay the short-term costs, try to soften the blow as much as possible with the help of all the policy tools. But ultimately, letting inflation go on like this is going to be the worst thing central banks can do for society.
Because